Welcome back. So we've spent a fair bit of time on Plato and Descartes on their views, and that is very common for introduction to philosophy courses. It's almost a requirement in introduction to philosophy courses that one cover some writings from each of those figures, Plato and Descartes. But beyond that, there's a fair bit of flexibility in terms of what to focus on in an introduction to philosophy course. And I have elected this semester to spend some time on David Hume, and I hope you'll find that that's a worthwhile choice. Hume is a very influential philosopher, would probably make the top 10 of influential philosophers in Western philosophy, but maybe not the top 5. So he's a little bit off the standard path, but not very far off the standard path. And he's a major influence on many schools of contemporary philosophy. So a little bit about Hume's biography. He was born in Scotland. He wrote in English, so the text we're reading was written in English. He also lived in Paris, particularly younger in his life. In his early 20s, he spent a fair bit of time living in Paris, partly because he could live there cheaply, and he was on a modest income. And he lived some time in England as well, and then moved back to Scotland near the end of his life. He published histories and essays as well as philosophy, and his writings on history were a kind of bestseller. He wrote them later in his life, and they actually gave him a kind of a very large reading audience. A lot of people read his history books, History of England, basically. But his philosophy was well known to people who were interested in philosophy and studied topics like this, but never sold as well as his history books, incidentally. And then he also published essays on political topics and things like that, and on the arts. His first philosophy book, A Treatise of Human Nature, was written at 24 years old. So I know we have a wide range of ages in the class, but if you can imagine either, what kind of philosophy book would you write at 24? If you're not yet 24, what if you were going to write your own philosophy book when you're 24, what will that look like? Or if you're already past the age of 24, what would your philosophy book have looked like at 24? A Treatise of Human Nature is in 3 parts. The first part is about the human understanding, basically like our minds, cognition, sensation, topics like that, memory, topics like that. The second book is about the passions. So it's in 3 parts. So the first part is about the understanding. And each of these parts is long, like 100 plus pages. The second part is about the passions, that is the emotions. And then the third part is about morality. And Hume is a very influential theorist of ethics, what's called ethics, question of what's the difference between right and wrong behavior, or how do we understand what it is to say that some action is moral or immoral? What's the distinction between moral and immoral? Like what should be the standards, and how should we understand what moral standards in general are? And so he is a very influential theorist on that topic, as well as on the topics of human understanding, that is human cognition. We're going to focus more on his writings about human cognition and what it means for metaphysical and epistemological questions. So questions about knowledge and questions about reality. We're going to focus more on those questions. Though we will talk a little bit near the end of the book we're reading about questions like free will and the question of whether or not there is a God. So this first book, A Treatise of Human Nature, was written by Hume at 24 years old. It's a pretty large book. He described it later as having fell dead-born from the press. Dead-born, like a reference to like a child born dead. The idea is this is a way of saying that the book had very little reception. People did not warmly welcome the book or buy large numbers of copies. It didn't sell very well, basically. Later in his life, he issued basically revised versions of each of those three parts that I mentioned to you. And the revised version of the first part is called The Enquiry Concerning Human Understanding, which is the text that we have and that we're reading. So Hume had another roughly a little bit more than 10 years to think about that topic since he wrote the first version, which was a treatise of human nature. And he used some of the same paragraphs and so on, but he did a lot of revision. And so that what he published in The Enquiry Concerning Human Understanding is really a different book, even though it covers a lot of the same themes, makes some of the same arguments and same points. It's a kind of refined version of the work of his youth, the 24-year-old work, A Treatise of Human Nature. Hume was notorious for being a skeptic and an atheist. So what does that mean at this time? Well, we'll learn a little bit more about his skepticism as we read The Enquiry, but the atheism charge was very troubling to people at the time. You think about this is the 1700s. It's still a fairly dangerous position for an intellectual to take, to be an atheist, to publicly say one doesn't believe that there is a God. Now, Hume danced around that point a little bit. He was sort of careful not to come right out and say that he didn't believe in God, but there was a fair bit in his writings that challenged traditional religion, and so he gained this reputation of being one who, even if he didn't explicitly say he was an atheist, it was fairly clear that if one followed his philosophy, the philosophical principles he had set out in his books, that atheism was a natural conclusion. That is, the conclusion that there's no God, or there's no reason to believe that there's a God. And we'll see some of that when we read, the later chapters of the Enquiry. He had another book on religion called Dialogue Concerning Natural Religion, which he arranged to have published after his death. He was still working on it at the time that he died, and he arranged for someone to publish it after he died. It's one version of the story is that he waited to publish it until after he died because he thought it would be so controversial he would really get into trouble. But just to give you a little bit more of a perspective on what the significance of being an atheist at this time may have been, Hume was a candidate for teaching positions in philosophy on several occasions. That is, he was basically applying for jobs and was a kind of finalist for the job of being a professor of philosophy, and was turned down on both occasions, ultimately was turned down because other members of the kind of learned world, professors and so on, said, you can't hire this person, he's an atheist. I mean, it's an extremely dangerous position that he would be teaching young people. So again, kind of some similarities here with with Socrates back in Athens, just in the sense that Hume's views were not fully in line with what were the accepted views of people, the kind of officially acceptable views of people at the time. But again, Hume's views have been extremely influential subsequently, and Hume had, even though Hume did struggle with finances for much of his life, he did have other ways of making money, for instance, the history books, and he had a number of other kind of posts in kind of like public service or kind of like an assistant to a politician kind of jobs. He had a number of those kinds of jobs as well later in his life. As far as his specific views are concerned, Hume is most famous for being a part of a tradition of philosophy known as empiricism. And this is basically what defines this tradition of philosophy, is the idea that all knowledge is rooted in experience, that everything that we know comes from experience. So the kind of basic empiricist picture of how human cognition works and how human knowledge works is that we come into the world as infants, and then we start acquiring experience, and it's just on the basis of whatever our experiences are that we have the beliefs that we do, and that we have any knowledge that we do. The most famous empiricist philosopher other than Hume is John Locke. John Locke is probably even a little bit more famous than Hume, and he came earlier than Hume. And so sometimes you'll see Hume refer to Locke, Locke, in his own writings. What he's doing there, he's just kind of referencing the tradition that he's writing within. So he's in broad agreement with Locke about empiricism as a sort of basic standpoint in philosophy. But Hume's empiricism has some peculiar features. Some people say that Hume is the most consistent empiricist thinker that there's ever been. In other words, Hume was really committed to empiricism and really tried to push the empiricist program as far as it would go, which some other people like Locke maybe didn't push it quite that far. And it was by pushing it that far, one could say, that Hume arrived at some of the most radical of his ideas. The fact that he was willing to kind of actually draw the ultimate conclusions of an empiricist set of assumptions that led Hume to some of his most radical ideas, which we'll again talk about soon. Hume's approach did inspire a number of later thinkers, including the whole discipline of psychology. The empiricist tradition in general, including Locke, has been influential on modern psychology. In some ways, Locke and Hume were the psychologists of the 1600s and 1700s. Okay, people who are writing books like Hume's, they were doing a kind of psychology, but it was a psychology that's a little bit different from modern psychology in several ways. When they didn't really do experiments per se, but another difference is that they were concerned in using insights about psychology or their models of human psychology to draw conclusions about things like what's the nature of reality, and conclusions like what are the ultimate justifications for human beliefs, like what can we know anything for certain. And those are still more classified as philosophical questions than as psychological questions. So by the modern standards of what philosophy is, Hume is certainly a philosopher as well as a psychologist. And so it's, again, that's part of the reason why it still makes sense to read Hume in, for instance, an Introduction to Philosophy course. Hume influenced Darwin to some extent. Hume's approach to human nature, you can see aspects of that and other parts of the empiricist tradition. But since, again, Hume is sort of the most radical one, there are some reasons, why that would be particularly, that would line up particularly well with Darwin's views about human nature. I don't want to go into too much detail about it, but you can say that fairly that Darwin's approach to human nature was influenced in part by Hume, and Einstein's views on space, time, and matter were influenced in part by Hume, but indirectly. They were influenced by this other philosopher, a German, more a scientist than a philosopher, but who wrote about kind of the foundational principles of science, what we might call today philosophy of science, Ernst Mach, in the late 19th century. So Ernst Mach was a physicist, and he tried to build his theory of physics on philosophical principles that were purely empiricist, or basically the same philosophical principles that Hume laid out. And Mach's work was very unusual, but very convincing to a lot of people. I mean, it attracted a lot of attention, and one of the people whose attention it attracted was Einstein. And so it can be said that through the influence of Hume on Mach, and then the influence of Mach on Einstein, that Einstein's views were partly influenced by Hume. And I invite you, with Darwin and with Einstein, to think, if you know a little bit about Darwin and Einstein, and when you read Hume, think a little bit about, what is it in Hume that finds affinities later on in Darwin or Einstein? What is it about Hume that actually works as a kind of precursor of those later scientists that were writing about their topics later on? And Hume is also influential, not just in the sort of broader tradition of empiricism, but in a more specific kind of empiricism that emerged in the late 19th and early 20th century that's known as positivism. And this is a very influential philosophical position. I don't want to say too much about it now because I think we need to get a grasp on Hume first before saying very much about positivism would make sense. But I will say that this was a set of philosophers that basically in the late 19th and early 20th century wanted to make philosophy more scientific and thought that most of the previous philosophy, Hume would be like an exception, but most of the other philosophy that had been written, including Plato and Descartes, had been really confused and not sufficiently scientific. And so in the 19th and 20th century, the positivists tried to fix the problem by basically adopting a very radical empiricist position. And there are some other features of their view too, but part of how they tried to solve the problem and make philosophy more scientific was by being more rigorously empiricist. And they looked back to Hume as a kind of inspiration for that. Hume has been influential in a lot of other ways. Like, this is kind of a weird thing. Hume was very influential on feminist ethical philosophy in the 1980s. So there were some feminists who wanted to emphasize the role of emotions in ethics in the 1980s, and they turned back to David Hume's ethical writings as an early. They at least pointed to David Hume's ethical writings as at least one figure in the tradition who sort of got it. They got the point they wanted to make about the importance of emotions in ethics, even though, of course, now they're saying in the 80s their points were connected with some points in feminism and about kind of different ways that they thought that a kind of masculine or a feminine ethics would look. But they thought Hume had been a precursor of what they were trying to do. So again, we could go on and talk about more details, but I wanted to give you a little bit of a preliminary biographical introduction to Hume before we jump into the text of the inquiry.